I meet people all the time who are not sure if God can use them. They're not sure if they have the skills or the talents or the abilities for God to use them. I'd like to share with you today how God can use you if you will make yourself available to Him. Listen to Romans chapter 6, verse 13. Neither yield your members as instruments of unrighteousness to sin, but yield yourselves unto God, as those that are alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness unto God. Notice in the middle of that verse it says, but yield yourselves unto God. And that's what I want to speak about in this session. Each one of us has a natural value and a yielded value. A value that is just being a normal person, or someone who has given their life to God. I want to use a hammer as an example. A hammer here is of very little value. I don't know how much this hammer cost, but it's of little value. In and of itself, it can't do anything. By itself, if you laid it on a table, it would just lay there. It can't do much. It's of very little value. But you take that same hammer and put it into the hand of a carpenter, the hand of an expert. They can do a lot of things with that hammer. By itself, it's of little value. But in the right hand, it can do some amazing things. It can build churches, it can build buildings, it can build furniture, it can build all kinds of things if it'll just be yielded and put into the right hand. That's how it is for our lives as well. In and of ourselves, we're of very little value. But if we will put our lives into the hand of God, God will do some amazing things through our lives. You might ask, but how can God still really use me? How can he still take my few skills and talents and do something amazing for Him? Well, I have 3 principles that I'd like to share with you today about the power of a yielded life. The first principle is this: God will do the miraculous with what you give to Him. And we see a good example of that in Exodus chapter 4 with Moses. God had come to Moses and said, Moses, I want you to deliver my people Israel out of bondage in Egypt. And so he says, this is what I want you to do. And we see that in Exodus chapter 4 and verse 1. And Moses answered and said, but behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice, for they will say, the Lord hath not appeared to you. So Moses is saying, okay, God, I know you want me to do something for you, but I can't do it. I don't have the ability. They won't listen to me. And you know the other stories of Moses there when God's asking him to do that. He says, I can't even speak right. People aren't going to listen to me. And so that's the way it is with many of us. We don't feel like we have the skills and the ability to do what God wants us to do. But notice the rest of in the few verses in Exodus chapter 4, verses 2 through 4. And the Lord said unto him, what is it that's in thine hand? And he said, a rod. And he said, cast it on the ground. And he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses fled from before it. A very smart person. And the Lord said unto Moses, put forth thine hand, and take it by the tail. And he put forth his hand, and caught it, and it became a rod in his hand. Now that is something miraculous. So God says, Moses, I want you to do this big task. Moses says, I can't do that. They're not going to follow me. And God says, what do you have in your hand? And he said, a rod. And he said, turn it loose. And when he turned it loose, God did something miraculous, and it became a snake. And then he said, pick it up. And he did, and it turned back into the rod. You see, when Moses saw God do that, his faith increased. And it became to a point where he understood that God is going to be the one to work through him, even though he didn't have much. So what did God say? What's in your hand? And Moses said, all I have is a rod. So I ask you today, what do you have? You say, well, I don't have very many talents and skills. That's okay. You give what you have to God, and He'll do the miraculous. Now, notice He didn't ask Moses for something that Moses did not have. He asked him for something he already had. And that's the way it is for us as well. When I was a teenager and I was actually going into college, I was afraid to speak in front of people. And when I came back to the States and went to a church, they said, we want you to give your testimony. And I said, no, I don't do that. And so they let me go that week. The next week when I came to church, they said, we'd like to hear your testimony. I said, no, I don't do that. I can't speak in front of people. The third week they asked me again. And I realized until I do it, they're going to keep asking me. So I said, okay. So it came time for me on a specific Sunday. I stood up in front of the church and my knees were shaking and I was holding on to the pulpit real tight and I gave my testimony. I thought I went for 20 minutes, but I think it was only like 2 minutes. When I was done, I sat next to my sister and I said, wow, I was so nervous. It seemed like everyone was blurry out there, like my eyes were crossing. And she said they were. And so I thought at that time, there is no way that God could use me. But there came a time in my life when I said, God, I don't have much to give you. Here's my life. Take me and use me. And He did something miraculous with my life. He gave me the ability to speak to people and in front of large crowds and to lead people to Christ and disciple people and start churches in other countries. God's done the miraculous. It's because I gave Him what I had. You see, if you hold on to what you have, that's all you're ever going to have. But if you'll turn it loose and give it to God, yield yourself to God, He'll take your life and do something miraculous with it. Now, if you notice in Exodus chapter 4 and verse 20, there's a little postscript to the story. It says, and Moses took his wife and his sons and set them upon an ass, and he returned to the land of Egypt, and Moses took the rod of God in his hand. It was no longer Moses' rod, it was the rod of God. When you yield yourself to Him, you become His, and He does some amazing things in your life. If you read the rest of the story of Moses and that rod, he did a lot of really cool things with that rod that God used in his life, and that's what He'll do for you. Here's the second principle. You find it in John chapter 6. It's another principle, it's another story. It's the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And here's the principle. God will multiply what you give to Him. It says in John chapter 6 and verse 8 through 13, one of His disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, saith unto Him, there's a lad here which hath 5 loaves, barley loaves, and 2 small fishes. But what are they among so many? And Jesus said, make the men sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. Now all these people were following Jesus as He was going around in that part of Israel and was talking, and they were wanting to see more miracles. But the disciples came and said, there's so many people here, they're getting hungry. What can we do? We don't have very much money. We don't have enough to feed everyone. And Jesus said, it's okay, just have them all sit down. And there was a small boy who had some fish and some bread, and so they brought those to Him, and they said, but this isn't going to help anything. Jesus said, it's okay. And He took it, and He blessed it, and they started passing it out. And it fed 5,000 men and the women and children. In fact, at the very end of this story, it says, they were all fed, and there were baskets of food left over. So as long as you hold on to what you have, that's all you're going to have. But if you'll place your life in the hand of God, God will take it and multiply it. You see, if you put a basketball in my hand, all it's going to be is really a basketball. But you take that same basketball and put it in the hand of someone like Michael Jordan, then it becomes championships. You take a paintbrush and put it in my hand, and you're not going to get a very good painting. But you put it into the hand of an artist, and you'll get a beautiful picture. You put a guitar in my hand, and it's just going to make a lot of noise. But you take that same guitar and put it in the hand of a musician, you'll get beautiful music. And that's the way it is when we yield ourselves unto God. We put our life into His hand, and He'll do something awesome with us. Amazing. Things that we could never imagine that He would do. I think of a friend of mine. He's a pastor in Kenya. His name is Simon Kibaki. And Simon Kibaki has been a pastor for many years in Kenya, but he started out as a young man as a long-distance runner. You know, in Africa, in East Africa especially, they are long-distance runners. And so Simon got saved as my dad witnessed to him. And then he said, I want to do something for God. But he said, what can I do? I'm just a runner. I just run long distance. How can I serve God? And my dad told him, just give yourself to God and be available to Him and watch God work in your life. And then soon Simon said, I believe God wants me to be a pastor, but I don't have the skills. I'm just a long distance runner. And my dad began to train him. And because he was available to be used by God, Simon became a pastor. His church doesn't get very large. It's in an area where people come and go. But out of his church, 21 men have surrendered and gone and started other churches. You see, Simon didn't have a whole lot to give God. But he gave what he had. And God has multiplied his life, even through these other men and other churches and people getting saved all around the country of Kenya. So that's what it means to yield yourself unto God. And when you do, God will do the miraculous with what you give to Him, and He'll multiply what you give to Him. And here's the third principle. The third principle is found in Mark chapter 12. It says in Mark chapter 12 and verse 41, and Jesus sat over against the treasury and beheld how the people cast money into the treasury, and many that were cast in gave much. Now that would be kind of an intimidating service to be there and Jesus standing off to the side and watching as we all gave our tithes and offerings. But then notice in verse 42, and there came a certain poor widow, and she threw in 2 mites, which make a farthing. Now, as Jesus was watching, the people that were wealthy brought a lot, and other people brought what they were able to give. But then all of a sudden, this lady comes in, and she gives just 2 coins. And Jesus says to His disciples, hey, check this out. Watch this, watch this. And notice what He says in verse 43 and verse 44. And He called unto His disciples and saith unto them, verily I say unto you that this poor widow hath cast in more than all they which had cast into the treasury. For they did cast in of their abundance, but she did cast in of all that she had, even all her living. Here's the third principle. God is satisfied only when we give all to Him. When we give all to Him. The widow gave her all. God's only satisfied when we give all to Him. The widow lady, she could have kept it. She could have kept it, and she didn't have much, and I believe people would have thought, that's okay, you're very poor. It's good to keep what you have, but she had a heart of self-denial. She could have kept part of it. I mean, given 50%, that's pretty good, but she had a heart of sacrifice. She could have complained about it and said, why do I have to give? I don't have very much. But no, she gave all that she had because she had a heart of surrender. A heart of surrender. I think about a lady that was in a mission conference in Kenya. And we had this mission conference, and we were sending out a missionary. And so people were challenged to give what they could so that this missionary could go. Well, some people came and they brought some money and they put it down at the altar. Some people brought some chickens and tied them, live chickens, at the altar. A couple people brought in some goats and tied them at the altar. That's what they had. And then one lady came down and stood in the middle, turned around and put her arms in the air and said, God, all I have to give you is me. That's all I have to give. And really, that's what God wants. He wants us to give who we are, all that we have, all that we could ever be to Him, and He'll do the miraculous and He'll do the amazing things when we give all. Now let me give you something really interesting. Do you understand what the description or the meaning of the word all is? Let me give that to you. All means all, and that's all means. Let me say that again. All means all, and that's all means. And that's what God wants. He wants us to give our all to Him. When we do that, He will do the miraculous. He'll multiply what we give to Him, and He'll do some things in through our lives that we would never have thought He could do. So that's the power of the yielded life. You still think that God can't use you? You don't have the talents? That's okay. Turn it loose, whatever you have. Just give your life to Him and watch Him do some awesome things through you because you yielded your life unto Him.